Well, good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Susan Elliott, and I'm the president and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. I want to thank all of you, if you're in the U.S., for starting early, or if you're in the Republic of Korea, for staying up this evening to be able to participate and listen in on what I think will be a very, very interesting and timely discussion. North Korea in 2025, next steps on the Korean Peninsula. So the National Committee on American Foreign Policy has engaged in this issue of North Korea for many years, and we have not only in the US, but in the Republic of Korea, many good scholars, contacts, and friends who have helped us to try to study and understand the issue of North Korea. So today, what we want to focus on is what do we think is happening in North Korea, and what can our colleagues and friends in the Republic of Korea and in the not only the region but the world help us to look to the future of relations with North Korea. So we've assembled a very distinguished panel today, of which our moderator is Susan Thornton. Susan is the director of our Forum on Asia-Pacific Security, and we're very pleased that she will be able to moderate our panel of both two US and two Korean experts. I'll let Susan introduce the panelists and moderate the discussion, but I want to thank all of you again for participating, and we look forward to your questions. So Susan, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Susan, and I'm really excited to be here this morning with all of you, our audience, and also with four good friends and terrific experts on the issues of the Korean Peninsula. There's a lot of unpredictability in today's world. We're coping with a double crisis on COVID-19 and also with the economic fallout from that crisis. And I think it's easy to forget about other potential unpredictable spots in the world as we grapple with these, but there is just a lot of unpredictability out there. And one of the sources of unpredictability that we face in these uncertain times, of course, is what's happening on the Korean Peninsula and what will happen in the coming months and years with the situation of tensions on the Korean Peninsula and over the nuclear program there. So we've been following, of course, very avidly what's been happening on Korean Peninsula diplomacy under the Trump administration. We've gotten now to a point where it seems that we're in a hiatus as we wait for the presidential election in November, and we're going to turn to our four experts to tell us what we can look forward to in the near future, in the medium-term future, and looking out to 2025, if we can think about looking out that far at this point. What can they help us understand about what we should expect, and also what should we be looking to achieve in this respect, in this area, on this issue in the coming months and years. So to join us today to discuss this, we have, as Susan said, two experts from Korea, and thank you very much for staying up late. We have Dr. Chung Koo-yoon from Kangwon University, and we have Professor Ma Sang-yoon from Catholic University in Korea. And we have our two American experts, Keith Lewes, who is the Executive Director of the US National Committee on North Korea and long time involved with events and issues in North Korea. And we have Dr. Lindsay Ford with us, who is currently at the Brookings Institution, the Rubenstein Fellow on Foreign Policy there, but had many years of involvement with Asia-Pacific issues at the Defense Department in the Obama administration. So I'm very happy to have all of you with us. And I think I'd like to start, actually, Dr. Chung, if you don't mind, with you, and then maybe we can just go around. And, you know, one of the questions is, as I mentioned, we're looking now at the current period in Korean Peninsula diplomacy. There's a US election coming up. It seems like things are in a kind of stasis and that we shouldn't expect too much until next year in the way of diplomacy. But what kind of risks does this period present? And if there's a chance for a new start, whether there's a Trump reelection or a Biden administration, what can we expect in the period from sort of 2021 onward, and how would you expect a sort of a revised approach to the Korean Peninsula to look?
Thank you, Susan, for introduction. My name is Guyan Jung. I'm from Gangwon National University. I'm really honored to be here tonight or this morning for this timely event. So my presentation consists of two parts. So what we want from North Korea and what we want from US and ROK relations. Well, I think that's a kind of constant things, and it has been rarely changed. What we want is a denuclearizations and establishment of peace and improving inter-Korean relations and US-North Korea relations. While the strategizing the priority among these goals or the foreign policy instrument to accomplish this goal have been different from government to government or administration to administration has been different, but every administration has pursued them comprehensively. So to countries, whether the second term of Trump administration or the new Democratic administrations, I think we should closely discuss this roadmap and end state in the Korean Peninsulars. And another constant is the maintained deterrence and readiness on the Korean Peninsula. And I will talk about this at the what we can expect part, but this part, maintain deterrence and readiness, is pretty important so that we can send the clear signal that North Korea will not get concession from the provocations. And third one is more geopolitical kind of suggestions that make sure North Korea issue is the issue of cooperation between two great powers, China and the United States. I noticed that on Wednesday, Senator Cory Gardner and James Lish and Mitt Romney introduced a bill, a strategic act toward China, which include the line that both countries can cooperate on North Korea. Well, this might be difficult. I think this have a lot of strings and conditions to accomplish these goals. But as Indo-Pacific countries, as Northeast Asian countries, and given the trend of decoupling between the countries, it's concerned that U.S. cannot ask for China's leverage on North Korea, as two countries are experiencing decoupling. And of course, North Korea, of course, would not antagonize China, which means that geopolitically speaking, denuclearization of North Korea might be more difficult as two great powers compete one another. So that's the third concern and suggestions that we might think about when it comes to North Korea's denuclearizations. Another thing which is related to geopolitical perspective is the reassurance from the U.S. Toward in the Pacific region. And I know that in United States recently provide a lot of legislatures as well as policy toward in the Pacific in a geopolitical, geoeconomy, and geostrategic way. But given the intensifying trend of U.S.-China competitions, Indo-Pacific countries within the region cannot but choose hedging or forging a middle power coalition without any reassurance from the United States. An America First approach, which has been maintained throughout this Trump administration, what is the concern of regional countries about this situation? So, this inter-Korean relations and inter-US-ROK relations and geopolitical landscape all together should be discussed. In the meantime, we are waiting for the election outcome, but that's the kind of things that has been maintained throughout the history, I guess. And what we can actually expect, I know that academics as well as experts talked about October surprise, which has been mentioned by Michael Bolton, but given that U.S. is more focusing on China issue or great power politics, and I don't think it is less likely to be for us to observe October surprise, nor we can expect another symmetry or top-down approach, which might be politically costly for U.S. government without any realistic agreement on the denuclearizations. But what we can actually expect is a gray zone type of provocation from the North in the meantime until elections. And North Korea has learned that it can use provocation to induce other countries to make concession, especially to put pressure on U.S. and its allies. And some would argue that decouple two allies. But this provocation is expected to get stronger as North Korea is experiencing economic hardship because of the economic sanction, as well as COVID-19 quarantine situation and shutting down the border with China. So Given the situation, it is necessary for two countries to talk about how we can narrow the gap between what we can expect and what we actually want, and especially for the North Korea and the Korea signal that this provocation will not be paid back with concessions, and that's the pattern. That's the pattern that both country has to kind of break in the meantime, so that we can maintain our readiness. At the same time, we can maintain the kind of virtuous cycle between these goals that I mentioned and what we want parts. So I stop here, and I'll talk more about this later.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Chung. You certainly put a lot on the table for us, and you made it clear, I think, how complicated all of these interlocking issues are if we're going to get a sort of coherent strategy to approach this very complicated question and some of the potential flashpoints along the road. Lindsay Ford, Dr. Ford, what do you sort of think about these questions, about what we can expect going forward, and also maybe some of the issues, complicating issues that Dr. Chung raised? And please don't forget to unmute yourself the way I forgot to unmute myself.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks so much. I'm really glad to be here this morning. Those were excellent points that Dr. Chung raised. I agree with a lot of them. So a couple of points I guess I wanted to make up front. I mean, one is the question of process. And I realize that we don't often start with process, but I actually think that the process here is as important as the substance, because I think one of the real challenges that the Trump administration has had is that they didn't actually set up a solid process that empowered people at the working level and the negotiators to begin with, and that has hampered them throughout diplomatic negotiations. So, you know, whether you have a Biden administration or a second-term Trump administration, I think that really one of the most important things you have to do here is actually set up a meaningful negotiating process. That's going to be harder if it's a second-term Trump administration, because I think that there is an expectation at this point on the part of the DPRK that they can simply wait those people out in order to get better terms from the president, and not have to be serious. And that's been deeply problematic. I think if you have a new Biden administration, they potentially have a chance to sort of set the table with new understanding in new terms. And that ought to be one of the most important things that you do up front, so that you don't end up in a situation again where you are sending leaders and you have an expectation that leaders are actually going to show up at the table before you've done the hard work of building out detailed understandings and agreements first. The second thing I think that's going to be really important actually doesn't have to do with negotiations with the DPRK itself, and this picks up on what Dr. Chung said. I think one of the first things you actually need to do is focus on getting the United States and its allies better on side together, which has been another really difficult problem related to the current negotiations, where we've seen at times the administration be offsides both with the Moon administration and the Abe administration about how to negotiate, about what ought to be on the table. And that's made things really difficult. It has been further hampered by some of the bilateral disagreements between the US and allies, most notably with the ROK. Some of the tensions that we've had over burden sharing and host nation support, I think, have really made it challenging to have the alliance in the kind of shape that we would want it in to proceed with negotiations with North Korea. Secondly, the difficulty in the relationship between Japan and the ROK, I think, also has made it challenging of late to have a combined alliance understanding and approach. So Dr. Chung raised the question of deterrence, which I agree is incredibly important, and the issue of how you bring North Korea to an understanding that the types of provocations and the sort of gray zone aggression that they have engaged in is not going to be rewarded. The only way you do that is if the US and Japan and the ROK have a combined deterrence strategy and a combined understanding of how we respond to those provocations. So to me, that's one of the most important steps is how do we actually get all of our allies, on side? And I guess the last thing I would say is if and when you return to the negotiating table with North Korea, I think at this point it's fairly clear that the large kind of deal that the U.S. was aiming for, that was part of why the Vietnam summit fell apart, the sort of maximalist demands that you saw on both sides, is not going to net us anything new. And so we're going to have to come to an understanding of maybe how you begin a bit of a less for less sort of arrangement, at least in the immediate near term. How do you do something that is not fully rolling back sanctions relief, but at the same time is not demanding some sort of immediate denuclearization, which is not possible. But can you do something that at least freezes the ongoing process or ongoing development that we see taking place in North Korea, that has been taking place throughout the Trump administration? We're seeing missile tests starting again, and most notably, these are new types of missiles, solid fuel missiles, that suggest that they're probably further enhancing their capabilities and have been throughout the Trump administration. So to me, that's the first priority, is how do we actually begin to slow that down so that they're not continuing to further advance their program.
Thank you so much. Terrific set of comments, very much on point, and I think we're really finding a lot of consensus between, so far at least, Dr. Chung and Dr. Ford, and let's see if the trend here continues. I will turn the microphone now over to Dr. Ma Sung-yoon for his reflections and comments on what he thinks is going to be the main focus, what should be the main focus, and what we're likely to see. So Dr. Ma, don't forget to unmute.
Okay. Well, I think North Korea may attempt kind of some provocative actions right after the US elections. Probably before the elections, North Korea will be somehow calm because of uncertainties who is going to be elected in the elections. And North Korean leader apparently has some kind of an affections for President Trump, and he has a kind of expectations that President Trump will give something that Kim Jong-un, Chairman Kim Jong-un might have already asked for. But anyway, they will wait a little bit more until the US elections will be held. But right after or right before the elections, North Korea may try to do something in order to, grab attentions of the international society and also the new administrations of the United States. Well, that I think is one of the bargaining tactics to seize an advantageous position in the future negotiations with new U.S. administration, new or continuing administrations. Of course, another provocative action taken by the North Koreans would have only hardening the American view of the North Korean regime, and I don't think it will give any benefits to the North Koreans. So I think even before the U.S. elections to be held in November, we need to pay attention to the kind of a management of the process, management that in which we keep our communication line with North Koreans and keep telling them any provocative actions before and right after the U.S. elections will give only less advantageous positions to them, quite contrary to their expectations. North Korea so far actually demanded even larger things from the United States, since Hanoi summit was failed. Now, well, recent announcement by the Kim Yo-jong, the sister of Kim Jong-un, actually demanded that the lifting of economic sanctions on North Korea is no longer on the negotiation table. She asked that probably what she has asked for was total dismantlement of the America's so-called hostile policy toward North Korea. That is really a kind of vague term, but it contains a lot of things, of course, including the lifting of the sanctions. So North Korea now demands a lot more than they have done in Vietnam and some years ago. So we have to be cautious when we start talking to North Koreans. A kind of thing that we can expect when things are going pretty well, and if we can enter into a phase of initial negotiations after the U.S. election, then probably we will ask for kind of moratorium on the part of North Korean nuclear and missile related activities. And probably we can give them in return kind of a declaration of the ending of the war. That was actually already have discussed a lot between North Koreans and Americans, I think, and the South Koreans as well. So that kind of declaration may be okay for North Koreans, and also not okay for South Koreans and the Americans as well. Another thing we can offer to North Koreans at the very initial phase of the negotiation is kind of a plan, our plan, or international and multilateral plan to give North Koreans kind of an economic development package. Well, already the South Korean government and our president Moon Jae-in indicated South Korea has an kind of plan to support North Korea developing its economy, but that commitment I think has to be somehow internationalized, so that the commitment will have a more binding effects, and with that North Korea may not somehow revert the direction of it. And another for the second thing we have to aim for is to strike a rather comprehensive agreement with which we can include a roadmap toward denuclearization, and also we need a complete list of nuclear facilities and materials and actual weapons North Korea has already possessing. And we will also need a timeline for actions. And those kind of things may have to be, included in an initial, roadmap. And without that, probably we cannot really gauge our further negotiations or actions is actually according to the plan or not. So at the very initial phase, we may try to get those things, but of course those may be on our wish list. North Korea might not, follow up with our demands or requests. So, but anyway, we will probably have to ask for them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A lot of good issues raised there, but one thing that I took on board from your comments was that I think you're saying as the North Koreans have now advanced further in their weapons development over the last few years, the price for denuclearization has probably gone up. Is that correct? So that's something that I think we should think about very carefully and factor into our approach in the future. But let's turn it now to Keith Luce, who has been thinking a lot about these issues for a long time. And please, Keith, give us your wisdom on these questions.
Susan, thank you. And I would like to begin by expressing my personal thanks to the National Committee on American Foreign Policy for the difference that you have made, the organization, in my own professional life, my own understanding of North Korea. It was actually 16, 17 years ago when Don Zagoria and colleagues at the committee invited me to first participate in Track 2s with North Korea. And I'm making this point because I think it's very relevant to where we are today with North Korea. I've been impressed through the years to see the degree of trust that not only the North Koreans, but the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Russians, and all the parties, all the key parties they have in your organization. And so keep it up, and I hope that in the future you're able to continue as a significant Track 2 venue. I think my colleagues this morning have made some excellent points, and I would just add from my perspective that it is possible that we will see some form of a diplomatic process over the next 6 months. Both leader Kim Jong-un and President Trump have at least one thing in common. They need a concession from the other. Kim Jong-un needs sanctions relief. President Trump needs progress on denuclearization. And even before the stresses from COVID-19 impacted North Korea, Kim Jong-un needed sanctions relief to boost his various reform initiatives as related to the economy, special projects, on and on. He was entering a stall period. And so sanctions relief became more important than ever. And while President Trump extended face, recognition to the leader, to North Korea, Kim Jong-un always walked away from the meetings with President Trump empty-handed and unable to bring sanctions relief home to convince his hardliners, among others, especially those who were opposed to engaging with the US anyway. He was never able to deliver. President Trump needs to show progress on denuclearization to move his agenda along. And we won't rehash Hanoi or Singapore. But I would say that whether we're talking Trump or Biden, as we look to the future, whether we see a positive trajectory on the part of North Korea engaging with the United States and other key parties, I believe that a crucial element to all of this will be North Korea's perception as to whether the United States president can deliver on details of an agreement. It's my sense that the North Koreans are looking for certainty in at least 3 areas from the United States in that regard. Number one, they often ponder, will the President of the United States fully commit to implementing details of an agreement? Number two, will the President enforce implementation of an agreement by his or her administration, by the key people within that administration? Point number three, sort of a final question, I believe, on the part of the North Koreans. Will the President ensure congressional support? Will the Congress come along with an agreement? Now, you know, in the immediate sense, whether it be in terms of Trump presently, as relates to point three, he has Steve Biegun, he has Alex Wong, people who have background with Congress, people whose reputation, I believe, is viewed favorably by the Congress. However, let's go back to the second point. Will the President enforce implementation of an agreement by his or her own administration? This is a big deal with the North Koreans. Just one anecdote. On one trip to the North, when George W. Bush was president, Vice Minister Kim Dae-kwon asked, he said, "Is President Bush serious about providing a security guarantee to my country?" And I said, well, that's what the president has stated publicly. Kim Dae-kwon immediately pointed to a US news article where an unnamed administration source indicated that a list of attack sites were being prepared for a US military strike on the North. In other words, we do have within our system, we are a democracy. People have opinions. People have different perspectives. And so the North Koreans know that there will continually be some individuals who are not in favor of engagement, who will not support an agreement. So at the end of the day, these 3 points, I believe, matter. Because while we may have our goals, we may have our talking points, our outlines for what we want to see achieved with North Korea, the degree of their confidence in believing that we can actually deliver, that the president can actually deliver, that is an important factor. Now, having said that, Kim Jong-un, who's undoubtedly, he and his colleagues are daily watching the US polling data, as is President Trump. The North Koreans may decide, well, actually, you know, we don't know what's going to happen with the polls, but perhaps we should have one last effort, one last meeting, maybe an agreement of some sort, because if nothing else, that could become a benchmark for a Biden administration. So just to conclude this part of my presentation, I think that anything's possible, and we'll just have to wait and see.
I love that you're ending us here in the first round on a note of optimism, Keith. Thank you for that. I think we could all use a little bit of something to look hopefully toward. What I'd like to do now is tease out a little bit from the conversation and the statements that you've made about on our 2 questions, sort of what is it that we want from the North Koreans? Because I think we've all talked about how a process will be very important, and I completely agree with that. That is key. We need something that's going to be more predictable, more steady state, and more long-term if we're hoping to resolve this, because it's a very complicated set of questions and issues, and the negotiation is not going to just be over in a day. This is going to be an extended discussion and series of steps, and I appreciated very much Dr. Ma's comments about the roadmap and the timeline, and Dr. Ford also alluded to the need to have this kind of a process. But it seems like most of us agree that what we want is denuclearization, which is a good place to start, and it's good to have that kind of consensus among us. But as we've seen in the last couple of meetings between the US and North Korea, there are very different views about how to go about getting at that. And I want to ask you, because Dr. Ford, you said, I think it was you that said we should start out asking sort of less for less. Dr. Ma, you talked about like having a roadmap, but what about the question of a declaration coming at the beginning of this process? And how would that factor into the chances or the sort of prospects for you know, a future re-engagement with the North on this question of denuclearization? And I also would love to hear people's thoughts on the sanctions, both the effectiveness of sanctions and what you think is possible in the space of lifting sanctions, or at least coming up with some exceptions for sanctions, so that, as Keith put it, you know, the North Koreans have something to show for this effort. And I think, you know, one of the things that I have noticed over the years working in the US government on North Korea is that it's very difficult to lift sanctions once they've been imposed. So maybe, I don't know, Dr. Chung, would you like to take a crack at any of those questions, or further thoughts on some of the comments that you've heard in response to your comments? You have to unmute though. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I would like to briefly talk about sanctions about North Korea. So in South Korea academia, there are many discussions about how to lift sanctions and what kind of approach we can take as an alternative. We talked about SDG, like Sustainable Development Goals, and how we can approach, how use that approach to North Korea, or we can use different, like for instance, like development rights, rights to developments, how we can use that to North Korea. We have many discussions about measures after we lift sanctions and also effectiveness of the sanctions. But what is kind of what we share is that at the COVID-19 situations, I think it is politically a good signal for U.S. allies as well as United States that we are kind of ready to engage by sending humanitarian kind of aids to ease the kind of situation in the North Korea, so that we can also gauge the situation in North Korea as well. But when it comes to the rest of sanction part, it has been pretty controversial in South Korea as well, whether it could send a different signal to North Korea as well as United States as well.
Great, thanks. Lindsay, Dr. Ford, do you have some thoughts on this? And don't forget to unmute, yeah.
Yeah, sure. I guess on your question, Susan, about the peace declaration, you know, I think what's going to be important here, I don't think we should be opposed to that right off the bat, certainly as perhaps a symbolic means of demonstrating a willingness to move forward in negotiations. I think what's going to be really critical, though, and this again gets to the point I made earlier about really engaging with our allies as a precursor to the discussion we have with North Korea, is one, we have to make sure, I think, that the United States, the ROK, and Japan are on the same page about what a peace declaration, what would follow from that declaration. And the concern, I think, that there has been oftentimes in the United States is that what flows from the peace declaration is an attempt to, I guess, dismantle the US-ROK alliance, and that ultimately that is what the DPRK is seeking. So I think you have to have a clear understanding of, would we, after declaring a peace declaration, continue to maintain exercises? How would we do that jointly? Dr. Chung talked earlier about the importance of deterrence, that when you go to the table, if there's going to be a peace declaration, that doesn't mean that you unwind all of the combined deterrence efforts that you continue to maintain in the alliance. And so to me, I think this is where things would get tricky with a peace declaration, is that you can, I guess, set the table in a symbolic way with a peace declaration, but where you may fall apart is on the back end, when North Korea perhaps expects for that peace declaration to result in something quite different in terms of US alliances than what I think the US and its allies would probably be willing to tolerate.
Yeah, I think expectations would be very important in setting up this process. And it's a mistake that we have made, I think, in the past to try to, I mean, it's very difficult. The communication with North Korea, I think all of us here have probably had some experiences, but the communication is very difficult and there's a lot of suspicion. I mean, basically only suspicion at this point. So to try to start a process under those conditions is very difficult. And you're absolutely right. We can't have suspicion among the people that are on our side of the table. We've got to, first of all, straighten that out and get the US and the ROK first and foremost together in lockstep on our approach. And that's been difficult too with this kind of unilateral approach that we've had recently. But Dr. Ma, please, maybe you have some thoughts. And I also want to come back to Dr. Chung's earlier comment, because most of the questions that we're getting in the question list are about actually China, and you raised this issue about the importance of China for the future developments on the peninsula, and many of the discussions around what kind of process would we start with respect to trying to get a negotiation going again with North Korea have to do with the role of China, what are their interests, how do we take them into account, how could China play a helpful role, and what are the things that we would need to protect against in terms of China's interests where they conflict with ours on the peninsula. So lots of fodder there to comment on, but let's go to you again, Dr. Ma.
Okay, thank you very much. With regard to the declaration, I didn't mean to peace declaration. It was actually about declaring the Korean War will be ending. Well, technically, Korean War didn't end yet, doesn't end yet, and we are in a truce system. But declaration of war ending is only symbolic meaning without legal binding effects. One might ask, what's the point of declaration with legally binding effects? But well, as Keith just mentioned, that the whole Korean Peninsula related matters actually are being done without trust or any sense of credibility. So giving some indications that Korean side or American side has a genuine willingness to engage North Korea, I think is going to have some positive. Now, I wouldn't say that will resolve every, all the suspicions that North Korea has, but it is going to be even a very little one have an effects of lessening North Korea's suspicions of South Korean American intentions. So even if it is just a symbolic one, I think we would have to try to devise every measures if it really works for lessening North Korea's suspicions of South Korean and American intentions. Well, I do agree with all the participants, argument for less approach. We cannot really make an big deal kind of an achievement at a very short time. So we may have to do we may have to try action to action and removing risks from with each other and protracting those deals over a number of years and finally reaching to the final goal of denuclearization. I think that is the only realistic process that we can think of at the moment, and especially given North Korea's their achievement in developing their nuclear arsenals and delivery systems. So I agree very much with the less for less process. Is the only realistic options that we may have. And with regard to the symbolic actions, I think that is necessary or helpful in order to improve the whole milieu against which we have a dialogue or negotiation with North Koreans.
Thank you very much. So Keith, you've been involved in humanitarian efforts with the North for a number of years. And I think one of the things that we often, because we're so focused on sort of the things that we want, we fail sometimes to take adequate account of the opportunities presented by various exogenous factors as they come along in this process. And I remember back in the 90s when I was working on North Korea, on the Korea desk at the State Department, was the time of the very dire sort of food shortage in North Korea, and the dynamic that we took advantage of in delivering humanitarian assistance to sort of open up some exchange and some trust and some dialogue that then led to a number of things that happened on the nuclear front. Of course, then we went backwards again, but in any case, sometimes something like COVID-19 can be an opportunity. Sometimes, as we saw recently, the Olympics can be an opportunity. Other things can come up that provide opportunities. And I mean, I just wonder if looking ahead, if you see opportunities that we should be focusing on, or how we can sort of pragmatically think about getting some of this suspicion, or try to set reasonable expectations, or get a dialogue going again, because I think that's going to be you know, a key to sort of getting into this process where we could even talk about, I don't like calling it a less for less deal, but, you know, a step-by-step deal maybe, or something like that. What do you think?
Excellent point. And of course, you've pointed to historical references in that regard, which did work, right? Humanitarian assistance to the North and the accompanying opportunities for engagement. However, today it's a different situation. North Korea, for the moment, is rejecting any US NGO assistance related to COVID-19. North Korea has turned away, has rejected a number of opportunities presented. One US NGO is prepared to transport a plane load of personal protection equipment to the North. North Koreans said no. The North Koreans are presently saying no to the entry of assistance, medical assistance related to COVID-19 and otherwise, not only now from the US, but from others as well. So this, of course, raises the question, what's actually going on in the countryside? You know, when COVID-19 first hit China, Kim Jong-un immediately took action, shut the borders, quarantines. He established a very thorough and aggressive protocol to counter the threat. That's had consequences, disruptions to the supply chain. What will now be available in the markets from which North Koreans derive a lot of their food supply? The North Koreans also are not allowing the United Nations, they're not allowing foreign embassies, they're not allowing NGOs to replace people as they rotate out of the country. So the country is in a virtual lockdown. And what does this mean long term? What does this mean in terms, as relates to the conditions, the health conditions, food opportunities for the North Korean population? I don't know. So you are correct. This, in the past, has been certainly a viable and a definite opportunity, meaning humanitarian assistance to the North. For the moment, that is not the case. We certainly hope the North Koreans will reconsider to allow private US assistance to again enter the country, as well as that from other nations.
Well, thank you very much for that, and I definitely appreciate the historical perspective on sort of what opportunities are presented here. I do want to go back to the question about China's role, because we have so many questions about how China plays in the space on the Korean Peninsula. And one of the themes to many of the questions seems to be, with the sort of new era of US-China competition, do you see any possibility for the US, South Korea, Japan, and to sort of use the North Korea issue in the competition with China? In other words, we usually try to think about China being some kind of a helpful force in resolving the nuclear problem on the Korean Peninsula, but many of the people that are asking questions want to know if there's some way that you foresee that that could be turned on its head, and we could use the North Korean nuclear issue or the issues on the Korean Peninsula in the context of a US competition with China. So I'd be very curious to get answers on how you see China being a factor or not in the competition on, and whether the Korean Peninsula is, how the Korean Peninsula issues figure in that competition. So it's kind of a complicated issue, but Dr. Chung, since you raised the issue of China and the deterioration in US-China relations and how that affects discussions with North Korea, maybe we could turn to you for some thoughts on how you see China, what you think we should be seeing China's role as, and how we might get them to play that role, or if you don't see a positive role, what you do then about China's interests on the Korean Peninsula in order to make progress. Do you think we could use the Korean Peninsula against China in this competition?
Well, it is an indeed complicated issue, the role of China on the Korean Peninsula. For instance, like geopolitically speaking, or from the security architecture kind of perspective, I see that there is a competing kind of institutional balancing between two great powers. For instance, like economic architectures that United States suggests, that economic prosperity network, or the security architecture such as Quad or Quad Plus, how these two different types of architecture can overlap one another, and what kind of opportunity and risk to given to the regional countries. That's the kind of one thing that regional countries are kind of worrying, whether South Korea, especially South Korea, whether our choice foreign policy kind of wiggle room could be kind of narrowed down over time as two countries kind of compete one another, and for that matter, North Korea issue can be kind of an issue for the competition as well. But so far, I guess China see that nuclear development and missile technology sophistication is also a threat to China as well. I think China believes that North Korea's technological sophistication is also a threat to the regional stability as well as China as well. So in that sense, they could cooperate, US and China could cooperate over time, but it depends on how these two countries can compete one another and degree and so a scope of competition over time, and that's kind of determine the future in the region, I guess.
Thanks very much. What about you, Dr. Ford? Do you have some views or comments on how you see? I know you said that you think the job number one is to get the allies together and in lockstep, and I think that that's right. You know, in the past, we've also worked very hard to get the entire international community to be backing our approach to North Korea, because denuclearization of North Korea is obviously of interest to the entire international community. But what do you think about the approach that a future administration should take to China's involvement in this issue?
Thanks, Susan. I mean, I think it's impossible to see a sustainable and meaningful long-term process with North Korea that doesn't involve China in some way. I don't know, though, that I would, if I was thinking about issues where I was looking at where can the United States compete more effectively vis-a-vis China, I don't know that like North Korea negotiations would be where I would lead. I don't see that, I guess, as a huge factor when I think about the overall sort of competitive dynamics between the US and China. I would say, though, that if you reinitiate discussions about how to move forward in North Korean denuclearization with our allies in Northeast Asia, and that China sees the United States and Japan and the ROK in closer lockstep and working more effectively together. To me, I guess perhaps where that enhances competitive dynamics, if you will, is I think it does create an incentive for China to want to be involved in the process, because it certainly isn't going to want to see something where either the United States bilaterally or the United States, Japan, and the ROK come together and start engaging with North Korea and China is left on the outside. So I do think that that allied engagement matters to perhaps incentivize the Chinese to be engaged in a productive way in the denuclearization process. But I don't know that I would say I see it as sort of a major wedge issue that's really going to enhance competition with China.
Great, thank you. I think I think that's a helpful framing for us to have, that they're interested, but that it's not really the issue for competition, and it's hard to see how that would work. But Dr. Ma, what is your sense on this? I mean, we have had 4-party talks in the past with respect to the DPRK denuclearization when we were working on the agreed framework. You know, and we got somewhere with those. What is your sense of how we should be approaching China on this?
Right. Thank you very much for raising very sensitive and important question. I think, well, China is a very complicated factor in terms of Korean Peninsula issue, because China has a, well, much larger leverage than any other country in the world vis-a-vis North Korea. Of course, the Chinese leverage itself is pretty much limited because North Korea always want to be self-reliant, even if they've receiving pretty much materials from China. So we have to acknowledge China has probably greater leverage than any other countries, but still Chinese leverage isn't really unlimited. That's a fact, I think. But if another factor comes in and to begin to play out, which is US-China confrontation and rivalry, then China's calculation of over the Korean Peninsula can be somehow shifted. Somehow, until now, China is helping and actively or reluctantly getting involved in the international sanctions over North Korea. But if Chinese confrontation with the United States intensifies further and further, then China might try to utilize North Korea as a card, another card, not this time against the United States and its allies. Then I think North Korea has a larger diplomatic and economic rooms to maneuver. So far, North Korea's room is very much narrowed down because of China's involvement in the international sanctions and China's cooperation with that, with regard to that. But Chinese come to have a second thought about continuing, involving in the international sanctions. Then North Korea will have a much, room to cooperate with Chinese side. So we may have to think twice about these aspects of the dynamics. North Korea continue to have a value for Chinese as a buffer zone. So North Korea may try to exploit this value, their value as a buffer for Chinese, especially in the context of intensified U.S.-Chinese competition and rivalry. There was, I think, kind of discussions at the early phase of the 2018, I think, when North Korea seems to be much eager to get into the peace process, which was initiated by the South Korean government and the Trump administration. There was a kind of an informal kind of discussions among the South Korean experts that probably this time around, North Korea can be a close, partner to the Americans, to the United States. That means China will be somehow sidelined from the process, and China, became kind of an isolated power in the Korean Peninsula affairs. It seems that, Susan, you have pointed out that kind of a possibility in the future. But in my mind, I think ganging up of North Korea and South Korea, Japan, and the United States seems pretty of lower possibility, given North Korean, continuing perceptions that their enemy, or at least the entity to get concession from, is the United States mainly. And if North Korea and the United States are being engaged in a very hard bargaining, then there's always a room that China can get involved with an eye to utilize those opportunities for its own benefits as well.
Yeah, I completely understand your comment, and it's my observation, at least from my perch of working on this, occasionally over the years, that in the times when the international community, especially the US and its allies, but also everyone else, are the most unified in the approach to North Korea, that's where we've made the most progress. And North Korea is very good at splitting us all apart from each other and taking advantage of the wedges. And we, if we're going to make progress, probably need to be guarding against that first and foremost. Before I turn it to you, Keith, I want to interject a couple other questions so you can have your pick from a broad range of topics. But feel free to chime in on the issue of the multilateral approach, China's role, or anything else you've heard. But we do have a couple of questions. One is coming from Mark Tokola at KEI. How important are security guarantees to North Korea, and what would satisfy them as far as security guarantees? And this is related to another question that we got, and probably we should come back to this. I mentioned that it seems that we have a consensus that denuclearization should be the goal, the thing that we want from North Korea, which we set out at the beginning. But a question has come about, well, everybody thinks that North Korea is not going to denuclearize. So should we really set that as a realistic goal, or is there something else that we should be looking to seek? And any or all of these questions, Keith, I turn it to you for thoughts on any of these.
Susan, I think we should also provide time to hear your thoughts on all of this. But, on the China question, Susan, as you've witnessed in the past, often in the Congress, for example, members will make the mistake of assuming that simply because China is the major benefactor to North Korea on assistance, et cetera, that China would be willing to leverage or to use that, right, in a way that would help force denuclearization. It's not going to happen. The Chinese interest in North Korea is driven in large part by maintenance of regional stability. The North Koreans, on the other hand, when they talk about their nuclear deterrent, they're not only thinking about the United States, they're thinking about China as well. This is a very complex topic. On the issue of security guarantees, yes, a security guarantee is important to North Korea. At the present time, it's my own opinion that the North Koreans do not believe that a United States president could actually deliver long-term on a security guarantee. Finally, on the topic of denuclearization, I'm increasingly concerned by the ambivalence that we witness in the foreign policy community as a whole about North Korea's growing arsenal, nuclear arsenal, weapons of mass destruction, biological, chemical. Years ago, Secretary Powell made a statement, which I believe was accurate at the time. He said to the effect the North Koreans need to know that if they were to attack the United States, we would turn their country into a parking lot. I believe the North Koreans recognize that. However, we are now in a different day. We are in a day when they have reportedly the ICBM capability of hitting the United States. We also sometimes in the West and as Americans forget about the impact of history on the thinking of the North Koreans. The North Koreans, it's not lost on the North Koreans, the South Koreans, about the centuries of invasions, right? The Mongols, the Japanese, on and on and on. Now the South Koreans, they have an alliance with the US. They have a security guarantee that they're trusting, at least I think they're still trusting at the moment. But when it comes to the North, I'm sorry, I'm convinced that if in fact North Korean officials believed that the United States was preparing some type of military action against North Korea. Now, from the US perspective, our planners might be saying, well, let's just perform a surgical strike to get their attention. I'm not certain if the North Koreans would have the ability or would necessarily discern about the nature of the strike. I'm personally convinced that even though the North Koreans would be aware that a response on their part could in fact result in annihilation, I'm sorry, I think that we're at a point in history where the North Koreans would be willing to in fact start pushing buttons if they believed that the United States was preparing some sort of attack on their country. So this is a matter of urgency. I think it gets lost because of the cycles of provocations in the past and cycles of North Korean behavior. But this concerns me immensely. So as we talk about denuclearization, we should be talking about stopping their production. How do we go about that? If we're going to denuclearize North Korea long term, more likely that's through a side door as opposed to going in the front door. Perhaps that could be included in a larger menu of items for negotiation with the North. And again, obviously, confidence building will be a part of that process.
Fantastic. It's really a daunting problem, and one of the things that you alluded to, Keith, that is an issue for us is that we have personnel changes constantly. We have problems in the US policy community is very divided on the approach to take to North Korea and talks about, the divisions very openly, publicly. You have similar divisions in South Korea and in other communities, policy communities around the globe, but particularly those two. I think it makes it very difficult to have any kind of a guarantee that the North Koreans are going to rely on at this point. So I'm looking at the question keeps coming back in the question and answer box about China. So I'll just read a question from one of our reporters, Eduardo Baptista from the South China Morning Post. We have a number of reporters on the program, but he asks, given the current bipartisan hostility toward China and the so-called death of the engagement policy, how might US policy toward North Korea be adjusted, both in the near term and in the next few years? So again, I think this is in keeping with a lot of the discussion that's come up about sort of, maybe we can broaden it out to sort of look at regional stability and North Korea's role in that, and the role of North Korea's weapons arsenal in that. One of the things that has been discussed a lot recently is the US withdrawal from the INF treaty, and what potential additional deployments and things would be coming in the region, including potentially with respect to North Korea. This has been an issue in the past. of course, when we had the THAAD deployment in South Korea. But I guess the role of US-China relations in regional stability, and especially with respect to stability on the Korean Peninsula, is there anything maybe for our Korean colleagues that you particularly worry about when you look at the deterioration in the US-China relationship with respect to the ability to try to mount an effective approach to North Korea, or try to get something started again on the diplomacy with North Korea? And maybe Dr. Chung, if I can turn back to you, and feel free to comment on any of the questions that have been raised. But again, with maybe just looking at the broader long-term picture for regional stability, given the difficulty of the problem on with North Korea, and the difficulty we've had over the last 30 years of trying to get progress on it. I mean, what do you think the realistic expectations are for the stability picture going forward?
Well, that's very difficult questions, I guess. So I think I mentioned about in my presentation, the last part, that in the short term, I guess there will be provocations from North Korea's side, and that's a kind of pattern. It's the kind of one-time thing, and it's kind of patterns that North Korea used to make a leverage against regional countries as well as U.S. allies. So I think there should be some sort of consensus or share the idea about how to break the patterns. And of course, within South Korea academia as well as experts, we are pretty divided about how to approach that security guarantee against North Korea as well. But that kind of pattern should be first addressed. And also, when it comes to US-China kind of competitions, well, there are many issues over Korean Peninsula as well, as all the kind of Indo-Pacific countries, we share kind of security concerns from China as well. Not only for the maritime, but also strategic kind of security concern. We share a lot of things, but what we expect in the short term is the reassurance, I guess. In the long term, well, it depends on how this US-China kind of competition will kind of folding out in the future in the regional kind of security architecture, I guess.
Great, thank you. Lindsay Ford, do you have any thoughts on that issue or other issues? We're coming to the close now, so if you want to make any concluding comments, leave us with some pearls of wisdom, we'd welcome that as well.
Here, Susan, you know, the missile question is an incredibly complicated one in Asia. And I think that obviously a part of the challenge here, and I think that what some military officials in the United States have pointed out in particular when it comes to missile deployments in the United States is that China has a vast missile force that is growing, as does North Korea. And, you know, China's missile forces are in large part about preventing US access to the region. And it has a real impact on our alliances and the credibility of the extended deterrence guarantees that we have with US allies. You know, something like, I think 90% of the ground-based missiles that China has right now would actually violate the INF treaty were they in it. So this is a complex challenge, I think, for the US to address. And I think that there is a real need, again, for the credibility of US alliances to enhance our deterrence in addressing this missile threat. I think where it becomes complicated is when you talk about issues like potentially deploying new types of ground-based missiles and potentially from allied territory. Obviously, the question here is, do US allies want those missiles on their territory or not? And that's a conversation that I think you need to have in the alliance context, not simply looking at this one question of, you know, ground-based missiles, but in the broader context of deterrence. And how do you craft an alliance deterrence that is strong and credible to deal with the full range of potential provocations that you could see coming from North Korea or China. So this is, like I said, this is complicated, and I don't think we should downplay the significance of the missile threat that we face from North Korea or China, but I also don't think we should look at any one specific capability in isolation, and you really need to look at the broader picture when we're talking about how to alliance deterrence.
Thank you so much, and thanks for taking up that question. It's a sensitive question. Dr. Ma, any thoughts from you on these various points?
Well, about the potential deployment of American assets into the region or into the Korean Peninsula. I think this is a matter, very important matter to the North Korea's calculation, their own strategic calculation, because that's exactly what the North Korea demanded. Well, in their announcement of, you know, U.S. abandoning of its hostile policy to North Korea. Actually, the item of deployment of strategic assets to Korean Peninsula is the number one issue, and number two issue is a joint exercise between ROK and US. So when it comes to the North Korea's mind in talking about hostile policy to itself, you know, those two items are on the list, at the top of the list. So if we think about, you know, easing tensions over the Korean Peninsula and trying to get some meaningful concessions from North Korea, we may have to meet those demands at a certain level. But obviously, we also have as an alliance, ROK US alliance, we need a minimum level of you know, requirement for exercises. So strike a very judicious balance between the two requirements, I think, is a very difficult issue, difficult question, but very necessary to solve out. Well, another thing is the Japanese, I think, currently are discussing quite actively about their, you know, capabilities to strike enemy. I don't know whether that's a correct vocabulary for them, but Japanese are currently very seriously considering whether or not they now have to acquire those kind of missile capabilities to strike North Korea or China, rather than only defending missiles from those countries. So development of those capabilities in the Japanese side only, I think, complicates the strategic, picture, over the North Korea, over the Korean Peninsula, because North Korea may have to think, take into considerations of those factors as well.
Complicating picture, yes. Sorry, Keith Luce, but we're going to count on you, I think, to bring all of these strands together and make the picture clear for our audience as to what the future holds and what we should be doing about it. So if you wouldn't mind wrapping us up, and then we'll turn it to Susan for our closing comments.
Well, thank you, Susan. I would just say that despite the content of today's discussion, which is, I think, has been realistic, it's addressed a lot of key points, I am optimistic about the future in terms of North Korea, US, the peninsula, a peaceful resolution of the issues. And one of the reasons I'm optimistic is because by engaging with President Trump, whatever one may think about President Trump's approach, et cetera, but the willingness of the North Koreans to engage the willingness of Kim Jong-un to travel to Singapore, et cetera, et cetera. This signals a willingness on the part of the North Koreans to explore a new territory, which I think we must continue to test very carefully. Secondly, we have the benefit in the United States of the leadership of Moon Jae-in, who has been an important part of these discussions and helping set the stage, if you will. Finally, I would just express the hope, and I realize this is unlikely, but I wish that the Trump and the Biden campaigns could come together on one issue. I wish the campaigns could sit down and agree upon a policy approach on North Korea, at least short term. This would do so much to advance serious discussion with North Korea long term. Secondly, the North Koreans would be less apt to play one against the other, everything we know in terms of how they approach. But this would send a positive signal long term that the Americans, the Democrats, the Republicans were speaking with one voice. And then finally, I would just add a subject that's not been brought up today, and that's human rights. Ultimately, for there to be any type of significant agreement which the Congress would support, that will require attention to human rights in North Korea. And so that will be an important part of the longer discussion as well. But thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this today.
Yeah, I think this has been such a stimulating conversation, and it definitely lays bare all of the very complicated angles. I really agree, Keith, with you that it would be so helpful for at least the American side to have a kind of more unified understanding or consensus-based approach on how to move forward, and that might also help to prevent what we see so often, which is, you know, a series of North Korean provocations that force us into a rushed process and a bunch of rushed responses, and then we're off to the races and we haven't really gotten our ducks in a row. And I really hope and think it's necessary, frankly, for us to get our ducks in a row with our allies, with ourselves, with the rest of the international community, you know, as soon as possible, and try to have a combined approach, at least, that we can all agree on. I think that that's key. And you pointed out Moon Jae-in's important role in all of this. He's, of course, got 2 more years in office, which gives us a certain other timetable in the context of the timetables that we talked about. So, you know, process has been mentioned, allies and unified approach has been mentioned. Different kinds of approaches that you could do is step by step, different things we could put on the table. There are a lot of things here that reflect a sort of considered policy approach, and let's all keep pushing ahead and hope that we can get that kind of approach going forward. And I think it's important to end on a note of optimism. This issue has been hanging around and festering for so long. It's getting worse, not better, as North Korea builds up its arsenal, and we really need to get serious, get unified, and come up with a realistic approach to this problem and try to get some progress. So I thank all of you so much for being with us today. I think it was a terrific conversation. I thank our audience for being with us early in the morning, and I want to turn it back over to Susan Elliott for closing comments.
Well, I would just like to second what Susan Thornton has said about thanking all of our participants for a very stimulating and very important conversation. And I would go back to something that Keith said in his initial remarks about what the National Committee on American Foreign Policy has been doing, not just in the past few years, but for a long time. This is a very complicated issue, and that we need to continue to engage. I agree. Not only with our friends and allies, but also with our adversaries like China, Russia, and other countries. So, and this is something that we need to do by building confidence and in the people that we deal with. And I think this is extremely important, as all the panelists have pointed out, in building a relationship and trying to come to some kind of mutually agreeable resolution on North Korea. So thank you again. And I really appreciate all the participants for taking the time, whether it was late in the evening or early in the morning for you. So thanks.
Thanks, everybody.